Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ryan Retro channel. In today's video I'm going to do a shootout of Switch emulation between the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and the Snapdragon 865 using the Retroid Pocket 5, the Odin 2 Portal and my Samsung Fold 7 phone. I thought this would be really interesting to do with the upcoming AYN Odin 3 and the Conker Pocket Fit featuring the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor. Let's see what state the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor is in before the arrival of the first dedicated Android handhelds featuring that chip. Just a quick disclaimer here before we begin. I do say most of these points throughout the video, but I thought I should just say them clearly at the beginning. In this video, I'm using a brand new experimental build of Eden. It's specifically been optimized to showcase the absolute best performance of the new Snapdragon 8 Elite chip. To keep the testing fair, I'm using the same exact experimental build of Eden on all three devices. This means the performance you will see on the 8 Gen 2 and 865 won't necessarily be their best. Those chips run better on stable releases like 0.0.3. So if their results seem a little bit off in this testing, that's why. For the best settings for any of these chips, check out the compatibility report on my website. For the Snapdragon 8 Elite chip, we have about 12 drivers available right now, and for the other Snapdragon chips that support turnip drivers, there are a ton of drivers to choose from. So I could sit here all day long trying different drivers, but I'm going to be testing 50 games today, so just playing each of those for a few minutes each, we're already looking at multiple hours of filming. Instead, I've just chosen known good drivers for each system. So for the Snapdragon 865 device, we've gone with the tried and true 9v2 driver, which is pretty much the holy grail for these devices. For the 8 Gen 2, I've gone for the 25.3.0 R3 driver, which I find works very well for me on my Odin 2 Portal. And for the Snapdragon 8 Elite, I've gone for the 800.46 driver, which in my testing so far has been the most consistent one. Some other variables to note is that my phone doesn't have an SD card slot, so all of these games are running from the internal storage, whereas these devices are running all of the games from SanDisk Extreme SD cards. These devices also both have 8 GB of RAM, whereas my Snapdragon 8 Elite phone has 12 GB of RAM, so those should give a little bit of an edge to the Elite device. But it's also worth noting my phone has no cooling fan like these guys have, which could help over longer periods to stop things like thermal throttling. And also this is my phone, so there's going to be a lot more things going on in the background like messenger services and other bloatware that might potentially slow things down, whereas these are dedicated gaming devices, so should be a lot freer from bloat. These two devices are also running in high performance mode to get the best performance possible. My phone unfortunately doesn't have any kind of mode like that, so it's just in its default mode. So with all that said, I think it's a pretty fair scenario we're in here. And you're going to notice when we do the testing that it's not really that much about performance anyway, it's more about driver compatibility. So let's go ahead and jump into our gaming tests. We're going to go through all the games one by one and see how well they work. I'll bring up a scoring system on the screen, and a system will get 1 point if it's able to successfully load into the game and play the game at least close to 30 or 60 frames per second as it should, without any obvious glitching, tearing, artifacting or crashing. I will give a little bit of leeway if a game's running at maybe 28 frames per second instead of 30. If it's somewhere in the ballpark, I'll give it a point. So let's begin with a really easy test, a short hike. This is a really small, lightweight and easy to run game, so unsurprisingly all of them are running this completely fine. We don't seem to have any compatibility issues between any of the chipsets. We're able to run and fly around on all of the devices, and they're all getting a smooth 60 frames per second. This was a nice, easy, cheerful start, and they all get 1 point each. Our next game on the list is Alba, another similarly lightweight game, and should hopefully give us a nice 2 out of 2. Interestingly, our 865 device here has crashed out of the game, whereas our 8 Gen 2 device has loaded perfectly fine, and so has our 8 Elite. I just tried to bring up the quest log on the 8 Gen 2, and we've also got a crash. On the 8 Elite, we're not getting any crashes, but we are getting the occasional flicker of textures in the background. It seems to have fixed itself now, but I did notice textures flickering in and out quite a lot as I played through this before. So for Alba, I'm actually not going to give a point to any of these devices because none of them are running it perfectly. But what is interesting to note is the 8 Elite actually ran that the best of all of them. Alex Kidd would be the next game, but unfortunately I ran out of space on the internal storage of my phone to transfer it over, so you might see a few games missing from the list. That's just because I have no SD card slot, so I unfortunately couldn't put all the games on, so let's just skip that one for now, and let's try Animal Crossing New Horizons. The Odin 2 portal has given us just a black screen this time. The 8 Elite, when I tested this yesterday, also gave me a black screen, but now has loaded in the game, albeit with some glitching textures again. The Snapdragon 865 with the 9v2 driver has just loaded this absolutely perfectly. And I have put a lot of time in this in the past to tell you that it runs absolutely flawlessly on this device. So this is going to be another point to the 865, and I really expected it to work on the 8 Gen 2, but for some reason we're just getting crashes here. Maybe I should try a newer driver, but that is for another day. Unfortunately, the introduction to Animal Crossing is far too long to get into a game for me to play it properly, but just in that very short example, there were already glitching textures on the Elite, so I cannot give that a point. And the 8 Gen 2 didn't even load, so that's 1 point to the 865. Next is a big one, Assassin's Creed The Rebel Collection, and we're going to be trying Black Flag. This is a game that's pretty difficult to run on any device. This time around we've got the black screen on the 865. The 8 Gen 2 and the Elite have both loaded in. So we're now going to see how well they run and if we get any glitching textures. Let's begin with the 8 Gen 2. So far it seems to be loading at 30 frames per second, but we are getting some texture glitching. Some textures are flashing on and off the screen. That did not look very good. So let's see how that compares to the Elite chip. We have a completely locked on 30 frames per second, but we also have those same glitching textures. If we go to the same location here, and this one is noticeably more glitchy than the 8 Gen 2. So unfortunately, due to all those glitching textures, I'm not going to be able to give a point to any of these devices for Assassin's Creed right now. Let's move on to the next game, which should be a really easy one, Deponia. One thing I do want to point out is having all these devices stacked on top of each other. The screen on the Odin 2 portal is just beautiful. I'm really shocked by this, but the game has frozen on the 865 and the Elite. It's running perfectly fine on the 8 Gen 2, but I really thought this was going to work easily on the others. This is such a simple game that I'm confident if I just quit the game and reload it, I think it will work fine. I'm just going to give this game one more chance because it is such an easy game to play. Second time around, it has now loaded on the Snapdragon 865, but it's still not loading on the Elite, unfortunately. And I think to be fair to the rules of this test, I should only give a point to the 8 Gen 2 that loaded it first time. Otherwise, I'll be here all day testing every game multiple times, and I just don't have the time for that. So on that one, we'll give a point to the 8 Gen 2, and let's move on to Dark Souls Remastered. There is an unable to connect to the internet bug that comes up on this game. Well, not really a bug, it's just a feature of the game. And I'm not able to do anything on the Elite, it just freezes the whole thing. On the other devices, I was able to get past that, at least on the 865. This, I guess, is a problem with this specific game, and it seems only the 865 is letting me bypass that. The other two have just frozen. There is music coming from the Odin 2 portal, so I guess it is doing something. It's just not really loading the screen. This box is closed, but it's just not loading the next part of the game, unfortunately. Whereas on the 865, with that holy grail 9v2 driver, we're getting into yet another game. This game is well known for having a lighting bug that needs to be fixed by mods, and I'm not sure if you can see anything right now because I certainly can't, but I am controlling a character. If we put the screen brightness up to 100% to try to see something, the game is playing, but it's definitely not working well. And guys, do you think I should give a point for this or not? This lighting bug right now is well known as needing a mod for on multiple devices. It has loaded the game up and we are getting 30 frames per second. We're just being affected by a pretty common lighting bug. I'm going to give a point here to the Snapdragon 865 because we have loaded the game, the frame rate looks pretty solid, there's just a common lighting bug. I think that deserves a point, but let me know if you disagree in the comments. Our next game is going to be Disco Elysium, the final cut. It seems to have not saved the game I created yesterday, so I'm starting a new one on the 8 Elite and the 8 Gen 2. The 8 Gen 2 seems to have frozen because we've got 0 frames per second, and the 865 has just quit me out of the game, and there goes the 8 Gen 2 as well. We've quit out of the game on both of these. The 8 Elite is able to load the game, but there are some serious problems with textures here. This is a game that I purchased a really long time ago on both the Switch and Steam, but I've never actually got around to playing it yet. I enjoy setting up the devices too much. But if you guys are familiar with the game, let me know if these are the correct textures because they certainly don't look right. So I'm not going to give this game a point, but if for some unknown reason these are the textures that are meant to be in the game, I'll go back and give it a point retrospectively. Let's now move on to Dragon Ball FighterZ. Here on the 865 device, it seems to be running nice and smooth. It also looks fantastic on the screen. Trying to look closely at the frame rate, we seem to be getting around 60 frames per second. Looks absolutely fantastic on this OLED panel. Let's move up to the bigger OLED panel now, the 8 Gen 2. Also looks great on here as well, and seems to be running at a very smooth frame rate. Let's move now onto the Elite chip. Getting a few frame dips here down to 50, but it now seems to have smoothed itself out to 60 after just a few seconds and seems to be running very smoothly again. Unfortunately, one thing that's a bit of a theme with the Elite chip is glitching textures. As we walk around, look at this. So hopefully that will get ironed out soon, as the devices with turnip drivers don't have this same problem. They look smooth and lovely. Due to those glitching textures, I just cannot give a point here when it looks like this. So once again, this is going to have to be no points for the Elite chip and 1 point each for the 865 and the 8 Gen 2. Let's try another Dragon Ball game now, Dragon Ball 2 Xenoverse. Or Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 even. The 865 has immediately quit me right out of it, interestingly. Let's just give it one more try while we're still loading the other ones. Most of the games are loading in order of power. The Elite first, then the 8 Gen 2, then the 865. If we look around to see if there are any similar glitching textures to the previous game, there don't seem to be. This one seems to be running pretty nicely. We have a smooth 30 frames per second. I'm not seeing any textures appear or disappear. This one seems to be a pretty nice experience, but I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't like this game, so I don't really want to spend much time playing it. But just looking around, I realize we're not into the main crux of the game right now, but it seems to be running pretty well. And unsurprisingly, the turnip driver devices very rarely have any of those texture glitching issues, so I think this game is running pretty well on all of them. We're getting a slight frame dip to around 28 frames per second here on the 865 device, but I think we can give a point to all of these here. Next we have Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake. This is quite a tricky one to get running. The Elite chip immediately just crashes out of it. I will give it one more try, considering I just gave the 865 another try. It's only fair. It just immediately crashed again, so that is out of this round. I can tell you from experience, having put time into this game on both of these devices, that this one handles it pretty well, and the 865 just doesn't really seem to have the power to run it in certain sections of the game. So, using my experience and knowledge with the game, I'm going to give a point to the 8 Gen 2 here, and no points to these ones. Next we have Dragon Quest XI, Echoes of an Exclusive Age. I really like this game. I've played it a lot on Steam and my Switch, and I think it's just a really charming and beautiful game. Back at the beginning of the game here for the millionth time, on the 865 you'll see the game runs pretty well, but the frame rate is not perfect. We're getting around 23 frames per second. Once it builds up the shaders, we can get a solid 30 frames per second in a lot of areas, but there was a glitch texture there and it does drop frames quite a bit. So in a usual situation, I would probably say this is a pretty good performance, but because I'm trying to be quite strict in this testing, and with the textures glitching a little bit and the frame rate falling down, I have to say I can't really give this a point because it's not perfect. And I was just about to say how the 8 Gen 2 is better at this, but just when I was about to say that, it just crashed. One thing I should point out is that I am using an experimental build of Eden here, so it might not be quite as solid as one of the main release candidates like 0.0.3, which might explain some of the crashes we're getting. But the reason I chose it is to give the best compatibility chance for the Elite, because the Elite is really the star of today's video. So with these little glitching out textures and the frame rate falling into the low 20s quite often, I'm not going to give this a point, but I would be okay playing this on this device. The 8 Gen 2 device here can use its extra power to get a pretty solid 30 frames per second. We do still get the occasional dips, but it's certainly a lot more solid than the 865. It also has less glitching going on, and I'm pretty sure the 8 Gen 2 actually can just handle this game pretty well. We did get that one crash, which makes me a little bit hesitant to give it a point. And we are also getting some glitches around, so just to be fair to this test, I'm not going to give a point to the 8 Gen 2 either, which leaves us only with the Elite to save us. So let's see what the Elite can do. Immediately the frame rate feels smoother here. It feels perfectly smooth. I'm sure if we look all around and compile shaders, we can get it to go below 30, but as I stare at the frame counter, it doesn't really seem to drop below 30. Once again, we have texture issues that I really hope we can fix, but the frame rate here is absolutely locked on to 30 frames per second, and it feels noticeably smoother, even than the 8 Gen 2. But once again, because of those glitching textures, unfortunately I can't give a point to any of the devices here, but it was very interesting to feel the smoothness there of the Elite chip. Our next game is FC25, and I'm going to save you time. This game just doesn't open on anything at the moment. Next we have Fantasy Life I, the girl who steals time. The Elite chip seems to have frozen, but we are still carrying on the other chips. Here we are loaded into the game on the 865. It seems to be running at a pretty solid 30 frames per second, and everything seems to be pretty nice, so a good point for the 865 there. I was just about to pick up the 8 Gen 2, and it crashed. And the Elite also crashed. So there is a win for the 865. Next we have my favorite game to play on the Switch, FIFA 18. This one has a bug where there are missing textures, and I'm not going to mark down any points for that because that's been a well-known bug for about a year at this point. And that appears regardless of what device you play it on. So we're just going to simply see if we can launch into the game and get a 60 frame per second frame rate, and I'm pretty optimistic about this one. Here on the Snapdragon 865, we don't have any of the HUD elements as expected, but it is running nice and smoothly. And I can tell you guys, I've put in tens and tens and tens of hours into this game on this device. I know it runs flawlessly, it definitely gets a point. The 8 Gen 2 loads a few more textures, but the wrong one, so still a glitched HUD. Once again, you're going to get perfect performance here on the 8 Gen 2. I mean, if the 865 can handle it at 60 frames per second, so can the more powerful 8 Gen 2. Snapdragon 8 Elite is a little bit different because we don't have drivers. And I've just conceded a goal, unfortunately, but once again, it's running very, very smoothly. Some glitchy HUD elements as expected, but a perfect 60 frames per second, and just a fantastic game. An easy 1 point to everybody there, a freebie, like Oprah would give. You get a point, and you get a point, and you get a point. On to Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age. This one runs very easily on the Elite chip. Everything seems to be in order, it seems to be very smooth, with no glitches or problems. It's all running really, really nicely. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 similarly seems to be getting a smooth 30 frames per second and looks good. And so does the Snapdragon 865, although noticeably this one is dropping a few frames that the others are not. So it might be controversial, but I'm actually going to give a point to these two devices and not to this one, just because it's noticeably a little bit laggy when these are flawless. So I do think there should be a distinction in the scoring there. Our next game is the beautiful game GRIS. This is a really beautiful, artistic, and very simple game. So unsurprisingly, it runs at a solid 60 frames per second on all three of the devices here. An easy 1 point for everybody. Up next we have Hades. So let's start with the 865 device, which seemingly has crashed, which is quite surprising. We get a 0 frame per second, and yeah, we have crashed out of that, unfortunately. Let's try the 8 Gen 2. We're running this one at a smooth 60 frames per second, and everything looks lovely. This is a game that I have no doubt will run perfectly smoothly here on the 8 Gen 2, and I also know does run smoothly on the 865, so I do think this experimental build of Odin we're using is causing a few issues for these quite solid chips. But I think it is fair that we use the same build for all of the devices, and that's just how it goes. So no points for the 865 here, 1 point for the 8 Gen 2, which seems to be running this really well. And the Snapdragon 8 Elite runs it well, but as is quite common now, we're getting some flickering textures. So unfortunately, this is just not running perfectly. Compare the flickering textures here to the 8 Gen 2 here, and you will see how it should be running. So here we're only getting a point for the 8 Gen 2. Next up, a really small, really simple game, and I'm smelling points all around. It's Littlewood. The game's so small that it loads up in about 1 second. Having a little look around, it all seems to be loading in all the textures properly. Everything's nice and smooth. And this is a game that's just not going to tax any of these systems. They get 60 frames per second easily. And unsurprisingly, we can give points all around here. Next up, we have Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games. The 865 seems to have crashed already. We're into a game on the other two devices. So let's see how the 100-meter dash goes. Let's start with the Elite. We just button bash A. That was absolutely perfect. Let's try the same thing on the 8 Gen 2 now. It runs well, but the frame rate does dip a little bit. I was noticing it go to 51, 54, and I felt that. I felt the dip, whereas the Elite was just completely, perfectly smooth. So I'm going to give a point to the Elite here and not to the others. Next up, we have Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and I should clarify that I do not have the new 3.0.4 update that really improves performance. I really wanted to use that in this video, but unfortunately I ran out of space on my phone and I cannot use an external SD. So to make it fair, I'm using 3.0.3 on all of them. Once again, the 865 has just not loaded the game. Oh no, there it goes. It's just a little bit slow. But it does seem to be stuck in the menu screen. We're having some issues with this for sure. As I said earlier in the video, we could try a more stable build of Eden. We could try newer drivers for this and this. There's so many things you can do to work with it, but to keep things fair and to not make this video take 10 hours to film, to make it only take 3 hours, I just have to pick one driver, one build, and just go with it. So I really hope you can sympathize with my situation. Okay, let's do a couple of races at the same time here. Maybe I'll try to get myself into the same position. But we seem to have frozen here on the Elite. Oh, we're back. The 8 Gen 2 feels very, very smooth. I do see the frame rate dropping to around 50, but I'm not really feeling it too much. The frame rate's nice and smooth here. It seems to be running really, really well. This is a great experience, even without the latest update. The Elite, however, has crashed. So we got 2 crashes and 1 working very nicely. So this is going to be a point for the 8 Gen 2. It's just a shame I couldn't try the latest update, which does help a lot of things. Next up, we have Metroid Prime Remastered. It immediately crashes on the Elite. I will just try that one more time because it was immediate. But unfortunately, it just crashes again, so not currently playable on the Elite, it seems. The 8 Gen 2 has also just crashed, leaving us just with the 865 to pin all of our hopes on. The Snapdragon 865 has loaded us into the tutorial, and we're getting around 60 frames per second, so we have to give a point here to the 865. My beautiful Retroid Pocket 5 does it again! Next we have what should be another freebie of a game, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. Again, a very lightweight, very cute game that should be really easy to run on pretty much anything. This is a game I really recommend trying because it's just so adorable, and unsurprisingly, we're getting a really smooth 60 frames per second here. It's a game that's just really easy to play on anything. Just looks great, it's got a really cute soundtrack, it's just a wonderful game. It always gets lots of comments when I feature it in my videos asking what this is. So yeah, check this game out, it's a great game, and we can definitely give a point to everything here. Happy days. Let's move on to the next game now, one that is far harder to run, Monster Hunter Rise, and one that usually gives me a lot of problems. The Elite has immediately quit out of the game, let's just give it one more chance, as that was immediate. Eden has crashed, we also got a crash on the 865. The 8 Gen 2 seems to be loading into the game. But now they have all crashed. The 8 Gen 2 got the furthest into the game, but unfortunately that just crashed all of my systems. So let's now try another Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter Stories. Here on the 865, it seems to be running really nicely at around 55 frames per second. It certainly feels very smooth. I have featured this game in some of my videos before, so I do know it runs nice and smoothly. And yeah, this seems to be a nice performer. Let's have a look at the 8 Gen 2. Unsurprisingly, with the 865 getting around 55 frames per second, we get 59 to 60 on the 8 Gen 2 with that extra power. And it feels even smoother. The Snapdragon 8 Elite now, we have 59.9 and now 60 frames per second, so maybe even 1 frame per second even better than the 8 Gen 2. But we are getting some light flickering, which is a really common theme right now for the Snapdragon 8 Elite, although it doesn't seem to be too bad. So I think in the case of this game, although admittedly we are just right at the very beginning and I didn't really adventure out too much, I think we could give a point here to all 3 systems. And you know what? I'm in a good mood. Let's give a point to everybody. Next up, another easy game, Moonstone Island, one that should give points all round, but let's just check and see. This is a game that looks absolutely beautiful on these OLED panels, and unsurprisingly, it runs at 60 frames per second on all of these devices. You're not going to have any issues running this game. There don't seem to be any texture issues either. Everything just seems to be running perfectly as it should. A great game to play on any of these devices. 1 point to all of them. My Time at Sandrock is a game that I've never been able to run on any of these devices, so I mostly play it on Xbox Game Pass, but let's just see what happens. The 865 just crashes before even letting me create a character. The 8 Gen 2 lets me create a character and then crashes. And I cannot believe this, but we are actually in the game here on the Elite chip. Oh, but it crashed. I was so excited for a second then, but we have now crashed. But we did get into the game, so I'm hopeful someday in the future we can get a little bit further and play the game. But unfortunately, it has crashed in each of them, just at different stages. The Elite got the furthest, then the 8 Gen 2, then the 865, but the end result's the same. They all crash, so no points for anybody here. Our next game is Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered. On the Snapdragon 865 here, we're getting 30 frames per second, and it looks pretty good. Seems to be running nice and smoothly. Let's just see how a crash looks. Nice. Definitely a good performer. So that makes me quite hopeful for the other more powerful devices. Here on the 8 Gen 2, unsurprisingly, we also have a solid 30 frames per second after getting 30 frames per second on the weaker 865. That makes perfect sense. And then on the Snapdragon 8 Elite, we are unfortunately getting some glitching textures, which is becoming all too common. We have a smooth 30 frames per second as expected, so if we could just fix those textures, we'd be looking at a really nice performer. But unfortunately, with all these textures flickering and glitching everywhere, I can't give a point for this, so it's going to be no points for the Elite and 1 point for the other two devices. Next up is going to be New Pokemon Snap, and for anyone who's emulated this, you'll know there's a really annoying bug at the moment where it's very hard to progress beyond the tutorial because it's hard to take pictures of the Pokemon correctly, but let's just get through the tutorial and see how it runs. We immediately have texture problems again on the Elite chip, which is unfortunately all too common. We also have some really weird bugs going on in the 8 Gen 2 this time, which is uncommon for this chipset. And it's the old trusty, old faithful 865, which is exhibiting no signs of any kind of bug. So let's just see how it looks when we're actually taking pictures of Pokemon. Let's see if those glitches carry over. The 865 so far has been perfect and seems to continue to be so. The 8 Gen 2 is also running pretty nicely now, as is the Elite. But as we move around on the Elite, we are unfortunately getting those glitching textures again, which is a real shame. The 8 Gen 2 now seems to have fixed itself, but due to those glitching textures earlier, I'm going to have to take points off of these two and give one only to my lovely Retroid Pocket 5. Our next game will be Ni no Kuni, although some people had a go at me last time for saying Ni no Kunai, so I'll continue to say that. Ni no Kunai, Wrath of the White Witch. Running around the town here, the 865 is nice and smooth at a pretty locked 30 frames per second, just talking to the townspeople and looking around. The 8 Gen 2 is of course very smooth as well, feels even more smooth. Even though the frame rate says 30 on both, it just feels a little bit smoother here on the 8 Gen 2. Interestingly, the Elite chip is struggling on this game. It's getting around 23, 24 frames per second, but it feels very laggy. It's not a nice experience at all. I can feel a lot of stuttering. It's dropping down to 20 frames per second. This is not a good experience. These two are good experiences. So 1 point each here, no points for the Elite. Next up, a little guilty pleasure of mine, a complete rip-off of Mario Kart, but with SpongeBob, it's Nickelodeon Kart Racers. We got a crash there on the Elite, but we'll give that one more chance. Second time around, the 8 Gen 2 has loaded in, so let's see how the experience is. Let's begin with the 865. Let's get a bit of sound on here. We have a pretty smooth looking 60 frames per second. And for anyone who's not familiar with this game, it is a shameless rip-off of Mario Kart, but it's pretty fun. It's Mario Kart with Nickelodeon characters, slime, and some pretty funny weapons, like big foam fingers you can smack around each other's heads. We're clearly getting a really nice 60 frames per second here. It's very smooth and there's no texture glitches or anything like that. So a point to the 865. Let's check out the 8 Gen 2. Seems to be running really nice and smoothly again. Oh, better than my driving anyway. So yet again, another point there. Let's check out the Elite now. The Elite also has a solid 60 frames per second, but unfortunately there is something you can notice if you look around. And unfortunately, it's that same old problem again, flashing, glitching textures. So unfortunately, once again, no point for the Elite in that game. Our next game is going to be Octopath Traveler 2. Loading into the game, we have three very different looking screens. We have a complete mess on the 8 Gen 2, we have flickering textures on the Elite, and we have what looks to be correct on the 865. Although we do still seem to have some textures loading in and out. If that is correct, someone please let me know, because it's been a very long time since I tested this game. As I walk around, you can see textures flashing and glitching on the Elite, which is just not good. And I don't see that happening here on the 865. So I'm going to give a point here, not here because of those flashing textures, and very obviously not here. Our next game is Persona 5, a game that has such an interesting art style, I'm never actually sure if it's loading properly or not. The 865 has unfortunately crashed loading up the game. The 8 Gen 2 seems to be running pretty nicely at 30 frames per second, and all of the textures look quite good. This is a pretty interesting game for me because obviously this is set in Japan, but looks very similar to the subway here in Korea where I am. Everything seems to look pretty nice here. If we compare that to the Elite chip, it also looks pretty nice. Although there is a bit of juddering and jumping happening with my legs. Are my legs meant to be doing this? I think that might be a problem. But it seems to be the same on both of them. Persona is a game that always kind of freaks me out because of the art style. I can never really tell if it's running correctly or not. Someone's going to have to enlighten me in the comments. But either these two have to both get a point or both get 0. Because the Retroid Pocket 5 couldn't even load the game at all, I'm going to give these both 1 point because they're clearly doing much better than this one. Okay, now we're getting into the big series a lot of people are going to care about, Pokemon Legends Arceus. You're going to notice something a little bit different about the Elite chip as we go through this introduction movie here. There's fire from Cyndaquil, there's a nice beach, there's a nice sky, but some things are missing. And that is all of the characters are invisible. I've played through this game on both of these for quite a few hours, and they both play this game really, really well. For some reason on the Elite chip, all of the characters are just invisible right now. So maybe you could say this was playable if you didn't want to actually see any of the Pokemon. But if you'd like to see the people and the Pokemon, unfortunately this is a bit of a fail right now. So I'm going to give 1 point to both of these and no points for this. In fact, you know what? I will give it a point. It's just going to be invisible. Next, we'll move on to a couple of Pokemon games that are pretty difficult to get running. I don't have really high hopes for, but let's just see how Scarlett runs. Oh no, there's the same problem. Oh, it's the same as the previous game. All of the characters were invisible, and now just the whole screen's disappeared. Oh, there are serious texture problems with this Elite chip, and I just really hope we get a fix for it soon. Because it has so much power, the frame rates are fantastic and it feels very smooth, but that's no use if you can't see anything. Okay, I just sat through the opening cinematic, which went on for about 7 years, and we are now into the game. We're just in the bedroom, we haven't really got out and ventured out very far yet, but both of them seem to be running at a smooth 30 frames per second. I did notice a little bit of texture glitching, just a little bit on the 8 Gen 2, but that seems to have fixed itself now. I didn't notice any texture glitches on the 865, it seemed very solid. They both seem like they're working well, so let's give a point each to both of these, and unfortunately I cannot give a point to the Elite once again. I also just realized Eden matches my phone's dark mode. That's a nice little touch. Let's now try probably my least favorite Pokemon game ever that I really regret buying for my Nintendo Switch, Pokemon Shield, which is basically just a really long cinematic. Interestingly, the 8 Gen 2 has crashed. I gave it another chance because it crashed immediately, and it just crashed again. I have played through quite a bit of this game on the 865, and yesterday in my testing I also played it on the Elite for quite a while. It's unfortunate it didn't save my progress, so I'm going to give a point to both of these because they did seem to play it very well. Unfortunately I can't give a point to the 8 Gen 2, which has crashed. I am starting to worry about the fact I used an old driver on this because this should be the most rock solid of all of them. So maybe I should have used a new driver, but the driver I'm using for this one I chose specifically because it has been stable for me in the past. Anyway, I digress. Let's just carry on with the test. Pokemon, let's go Pikachu. The 8 Gen 2 has crashed once again. In my testing on the Elite yesterday, it crashed in this exact same place, but today seems to be loading a little bit better. Unfortunately though, the textures are just messed up again, so I can't give a point to either of these. We're left only with the 865. The 865 is running absolutely flawlessly. This looks beautiful, and I have played this game on the 865 before, so I can tell you it does work very well. 1 point to the 865, no points to these. Next up, let's jump into Portal 2, one of my favorite games to play on my Steam Deck, but in my experience, not running very well on Switch emulation. The Snapdragon Elite and the 865 are stuck on this no internet screen once again and have frozen. The 8 Gen 2 seems to be loading perfectly at 60 frames per second, so 1 point here. Our next game is Red Dead Redemption, one that just recently became pretty nicely playable on the 865 with recent Eden updates. Here on the 865, we seem to be getting a pretty solid 30 frames per second. The 8 Gen 2, unsurprisingly, is also a pretty nice solid 30 frames per second as well. And the Snapdragon Elite, we can be pretty confident we'll get 30 frames per second, so what we really just need to look out for is any of those glitching textures. There may be one or two here or there, but I would say overall, this looks pretty nice. So I think here we can give 1 point all round. Our next game is Rune Factory 5. The Retroid Pocket 5 seems to have loaded the game up nicely. We're getting a 30 frame per second, which looks quite solid. There are a few strange looking textures at the top of the screen, which I can't imagine are meant to be here. Hi, Wooly. But this looks pretty nice. Let's see how it compares to the 8 Gen 2. The 8 Gen 2 has even more of those weird textures over the screen. It just looks kind of dirty. Once again, great performance, but a shame about those specks of dirt over the screen, which I can't assume are meant to be there. Let's see if the Elite is any better. And if you've been watching the video so far, you'll know, of course it's not. It's absolutely worse. We have endless flashing lights. And the performance also seems to be a bit worse too. It feels noticeably quite laggy. So what do you guys think about these ones? Do these little specks of dirt mean I have to give no points to anything? I think I should give points to these two devices and nothing for this laggy, flashy mess. Next up, we have one of my favorite games of all time, Slay the Spire. I put almost 2,000 hours into this on my Steam Deck at this point. And quite strangely, it just doesn't load on any of them. No points here. Maybe my devices are giving me some kind of intervention. Anyway, on to the next game, Spiritfarer. Spiritfarer is a pretty simplistic game that I expected to be a home run across the board, but it actually is not at all. Once again, the 8 Gen 2 has just completely crashed. The 865 is getting around 45 frames per second when really it should be getting 60, so definitely not a perfect performance here. And it is the Snapdragon 8 Elite here that has a perfectly smooth 60 frames per second, and it just looks really smooth and beautiful. Much smoother than my jumping, that's for sure. So here in this case, we can give 1 point to the Elite, which is just running this beautifully, and no points to the other two. Our next game is Stray, one which can be a little bit tricky to run at times. Just at the beginning of the game here, let's see how it runs. As I said, it's quite tricky. The 865 here is only managing around 20 frames per second. It may improve as we build more shaders, but this game is definitely a little bit demanding for the 865. The 8 Gen 2, on the other hand, is handling this like a champion at 30 frames per second, and it feels very, very smooth. The 8 Elite is also running this really nicely too at 30 frames per second, but you're going to see those familiar problems with the Elite, things just flashing in and out. And I'm not just talking about the lightning storm, but textures appearing and disappearing. On the edge here, it's just not a great experience compared to the smoothness of the 8 Gen 2 here, which just looks wonderful. This one is definitely a point for the 8 Gen 2. Next we have Super Mario 3D All-Stars, that really expensive game. In the interest of my time and sanity, I'm just going to jump into what should be the most demanding one, Super Mario Galaxy. The 865 loads in with around 50 to 60 frames per second and feels nice and smooth, whereas the other two have unfortunately both crashed, so a point to the 8 Gen 2 here. Next up is Super Mario Odyssey. Running around the beginning of the game here, it's noticeably a little bit slow on the 865. We are getting in the 50s for frames per second, but it's dropping down to the 40s, and it's just noticeably not perfectly smooth. Moving on to the 8 Gen 2 with the extra power here, once again in the mid 50s to 60s, it feels a lot smoother than the 865. And I would say this is very nicely playable, a very nice experience indeed. Moving on to the Elite now, we get a pretty locked on 60 frames per second. The frame rate of this Elite chip is just so good. But once again, if I spin the camera around, you're going to see glitching textures. I hope this is visible on the camera. It's very easy for me to see with my eyes. But that is just the story so far of the Elite. So many glitching textures, but such great performance. So in this case, because of the glitching textures here and the slow frame rate here, I'm only giving a point to the 8 Gen 2, which has a mixture of a super smooth frame rate and no glitching textures. Next we have Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I'm not a big fan of this franchise, so don't judge me here on my fighting skills. It's a little bit laggy here on the 865. It's definitely not a good experience. I'm not giving a point over here. Let's move on to the 8 Gen 2. Still not a smooth 60 frames per second, but noticeably better than the 865. I would say this is a decent experience, but not a smooth 60, more like 55. So I'm hoping maybe with the power of the Elite here, we're going to get up to 60. Right away, we're looking at around 53, so actually a little bit lower than the 8 Gen 2. None of them have a smooth frame rate, and I would say the 8 Gen 2 is the best overall. So whether I give 1 point to the 8 Gen 2 and none to the others, or I just give no points to anyone, I'm inclined to not give any points to any of them because none of them are perfectly smooth. So I'm going to give no points here, but I will say the 8 Gen 2 is the best. Next, a cult classic for me, Tennis in the Face. I won't waste your time. I used to play this 15 years ago on a Windows phone. It runs perfectly. Now let's get into what you've been waiting for, Breath of the Wild. On the Snapdragon 865, we get around 20 to 25 frames per second and milky water, but both of these things can be fixed with Mr. Turnip drivers, giving 30 frames per second and clear water. It's a really nice experience, and I've put a lot of hours into this on the 865. The 8 Gen 2 gets better performance, lovely looking water, and around 30 frames per second. Once again, a great experience. The Elite, however, just cannot play this game. I've done so many tries, so many attempts to load this game, it just crashes every time and seems unfortunately unplayable right now on the Elite. Next up we have Link's Awakening. This one has a very common bug with flashing, flickering lights. Sorry for this visual, you can fix this bug with a couple of mods. Just try to ignore that and look at the frame rate. We have a pretty solid 55-ish frames per second on the 8 Gen 2. We have around maybe 45 to 50 on the 865, and we also have around 56 to 57 on the Elite here. But this is a game that runs pretty easily once you get all the mods worked out, so I'm going to give a point to all of these. Don't worry about this flickering, it's a really common bug. Next we have Skyward Sword HD, a remaster of an old game. This game is really easy to run and gets an easy 60 frames per second on the 865 and the Elite. But for some reason, I cannot start the game here on the portal. I see the start button lighting up. It hasn't frozen. It just won't let me launch the game for some reason or other. So 1 point to both of these, no point for the 8 Gen 2. Next up, another big one, Tears of the Kingdom. We're here in the Room of Awakening. The 865 unfortunately just couldn't even load the game. The 8 Gen 2 has loaded it up pretty nicely. We've got 30 frames per second and it looks good. The Elite unfortunately has so many problems with the textures. It's just a complete mess. We once again do have a pretty decent frame rate, but the textures are just absolutely horrible here. I can't even find my way. I think I'm in a lake. Where am I going? Let's just run out of the room here on the Odin 2 portal and jump off the edge and just see how it looks with at least mostly working textures. Here we're going to give 1 point to the Odin 2 portal, the 8 Gen 2, and no points for either of these. Our next game is The Witcher 3. This game I've showed a little bit on my channel before, but back in the starting room here, the 865 unfortunately just doesn't have the power to play this game, getting only around 12 frames per second at best. The 8 Gen 2, on the other hand, plays it pretty smoothly. It does slow down here and there, but you can get this working with a bit of tinkering. Here it's around 25 frames per second. The Elite, on the other hand, has that all-familiar problem of just absolutely horrific textures, but a locked 30 frames per second. It's just so close to being awesome if we can fix these textures. Here I cannot give a point for anything, but I do think with a bit of tinkering, the 8 Gen 2 will be fine. Our final game is Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but I'm just going to save you the time. It doesn't work on any of them right now. So that brings us to the end of the list, and here are the final scores on the screen. What do you think? Is it what you expected? Are you surprised by any of the scores? I'm a little bit surprised the 865 and the 8 Gen 2 crashed as much as they did, and I think it's probably due to the fact that we're using an experimental developmental build of Eden. With the more established builds, they can do better than this, which which also makes me hopeful in the future the Elite will do better than this as well. Of course, this wasn't a perfect test. I only ran the beginnings of a lot of games, and not for very long, but even just doing that, it's still taken me about 3 hours if you'll see the clock on my screen. I put a lot of time and effort into this video that I hope you can appreciate, and if you do, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. That really means a lot to me and helps me out. I also ran through all of these tests on the Elite yesterday, and my results might have been a little bit different, and I've put that together in a little spreadsheet for you that you can look through if you want. I'll link it in the description if you'd like to look through once more and see how the Elite did in my around 52 games test. You can check that out for your own information. I'm really happy with what the guys at Eden have done. This is better than I expected, honestly, considering we have no turnip drivers. The power of this thing is just incredible. It often gets a solid 30 or 60 frames per second in almost any game I throw at it. It feels so smooth. When I'm controlling it, it just feels noticeably smoother than anything else. It's really amazing, and I just hope we get turnip drivers soon. So if you're looking to buy an Odin 3 or a Conker Pocket Fit, just know that without drivers, it's a bit hit and miss, and mostly miss at the moment, especially with those glitching textures. But I really hope it improves and we get more compatibility soon. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Have a lovely day.